Good evening and welcome to D Infinity Live, the multi-platform, multi-publisher game show for your entertainment and enjoyment. My name is Robert Groover. I am your host. Thank you for joining us tonight. Remember, you can tweet us at D Infinity Live right now with your questions and comments about the show, and we'll talk about them live. I'd like to welcome first up Will Thrasher. Good evening, William.
Hello.
Welcome to the show. Also welcome Richard Balsley. Good evening, sir.
Hi.
Good to have you tonight. Next up, Michael Varhola. Good evening, Mike.
Evening.
Good to have you. And lastly, we have our special guest host tonight, Brendan Cass. Welcome to the show, Brendan. You are the IT guy for the Skirmisher and D Infinity websites, isn't that right?
Yeah.
Right on. Well, we're glad to have you on the show. So tonight we have we're going to start off tonight with a very special announcement. Those who follow us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, you would have heard about it earlier today. But the D Infinity website is now live at d-infinity.net. Is that right?
Yep, it's d-infinity.net. That's correct.
So tell us a little about the website, Mike. You had a post today on our website about it. Tell us about what D Infinity website is, what it's all about.
All right, well, I'll talk about that very briefly, and then for any of the more detailed stuff, we'll go over to Brendan. I'm speaking as a game developer and a layman rather than as a IT guy when I say this is one of the most cutting-edge, up-to-date, awesome websites that I have seen in a long time. It is absolutely solid, and it is really a tribute to everything we're doing with D Infinity that we've got such a cutting-edge site as an adjunct for it. And basically, that's what it is. D Infinity Live, or D Infinity Online, as I call it, rather, is basically the online corollary to the D Infinity print and PDF magazine. So it's got all the same departments that are in the magazine, but with exclusive content that we can't necessarily fit into the print edition. It's got exclusive departments that don't appear anywhere else. It's got cutting-edge bloggers. It's got just really, it is an online gaming magazine, for want of a better term. But there is a lot out there on the web. I think it's a fair question for people to say, oh, okay, well, that sounds great. Everything you've just said, I can tell you 10 sites that are doing the same thing. And that is a fair observation, and we were aware of that when we went into this. And the answer to that question is, they've got issues, and what we're doing with this addresses those issues and does better than most of what's out there. So.
Yeah, and there's some other clearinghouses for RPG information on the internet, but I've never found one that I really liked too much. And I think part of it may be like a technical issue. The websites are hard to go through. They're hard to find information about. Brendan, what have you done to help bring that user experience to the forefront that's been lacking on other types of websites like this? Looks like Brendan might be having technical issues.
Can you hear us, Brendan?
A lot of it was applying my field of study, so I'm really concerned with the whole user.
I think he may be having some technical issues, Mike. So let's talk for another minute, Richard. You're a big blogger on the Skirmisher site. We've talked about your blogs before. Is that stuff going to carry over to the new site? Are you going to be able to continue on with all that great blogging that you do?
Yeah, from everything that I've been able to learn from Brendan about how he set everything up, there's really no big change other than the link to where people will go, like the address for where each post will be. Other than that, it's going to be the same content. I hope that it's as seamless of a transition as possible. And some of the things that I did refer to previous posts, but for the most part, they're all individual. So, and I plan to keep my writing mostly individual in terms of like that topic, and not try to build too much on previous material. Mostly because I don't want people to have to feel like they missed out on something. I mean, there will be things that do carry over, but for the most part, I try to keep everything as isolated as possible for just that particular issue. And if I feel I have to revisit an issue, I might come back and say, okay, well, this refers to this particular piece. But other than that, my material hasn't really changed, and I don't think it will.
Right, and that's a good point. And my blogging will all move over there, except for stuff that we talk about that is specifically Skirmisher. I think that's kind of one of the big things is we've wanted to separate the two, so that the stuff we talk about at Skirmisher will be on the Skirmisher site, and the stuff we talk about that's going to be more broadly industry based would be on the D-Infinity site, as well as some Skirmisher stuff, since Skirmisher is of course a co-publisher of the magazine.
Yeah.
Mike, that was a big decision, a right decision for the companies, I think.
Yeah, it was. We did not want D-Infinity. We didn't want anybody to go to the D-Infinity site and say, oh, D-Infinity is a multi-platform, multi-publisher game supplement. Why is it that everything I see on dinfinity.net is the same as what I see on skirmisher.com? We didn't want anyone to ever ask that question. And really, when people go to D-Infinity, what they're going to see is things that are not affiliated with any company in particular. On the Skirmisher site, people are going to see things affiliated with Skirmisher products.
Right.
It's product support, it's product announcement, it's bonus material. But on D-Infinity, what they're going to be seeing are things that don't necessarily tie in with any particular game product, things that tie in with third-party systems that we don't own, that Skirmisher doesn't own. So, for example, content tying in with OSR games or D20 games or Pathfinder games. We're licensed for those, but those are not properties we own. And then, just as importantly, material tying in with completely other publishers. So Skirmisher will have some stuff there because it's one of the dozen co-publishers of D-Infinity. But ArmorCast and Dagon Industries and Off-World Designs and a number of other companies and ventures, they're all co-publishers of D-Infinity. So one of our goals with D-Infinity from day one was to have many voices and many different game platforms and many different ideas, not just the ideas of one company, not just the ideas of a few developers. So D-Infinity Online is going to reflect many, many voices, many points of view, many different games.
And one note we should make is the Skirmisher site and the Skirmisher forums are still going to be there. We use that for our development. Will and I go back and forth all the time, talking about things. Will, that kind of community is still important, I think, for developers and such. So that's going to be staying. What are your views on having that sort of community, even on separate from what D-Infinity is doing? How important is that?
No, I mean, well, it's going to be incredibly useful to us, if only because we have got so much momentum already going on the Skirmisher forums. It would be a real shame to kill that momentum and just do a hard shift of focus to D-Infinity. So we're gonna keep the momentum going on the Skirmisher website, on the Skirmisher forums, and then start building that same kind of heavy momentum for the D-Infinity site.
Yeah, and Mike, this isn't the first iteration of the websites, and it probably won't be the last, knowing how technology works. But it seems like you're pretty proud of it. You looking on it and from the way you sound about it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Basically, for the last somewhat more than a year, we've had a blogger page that we were using more or less as a placeholder for a D-Infinity site. So really, if you were to go to D-Infinity at blogspot.com, you would have found a lot of good content. There were prop room articles by Will Thrasher and by Megan Irvine of Dark Threads on how to make all sorts of costumes. There were some exclusive practical modeling articles that didn't appear anywhere else. There were interviews. So there's been a lot of good content up. A lot of bonus material that never appeared in the magazine, that was never available anywhere else. But that format that we had was very user-friendly from the point of view of people who wanted to post material. It wasn't necessarily as user-friendly from the point of view of people who wanted to read or access the material. And it was fine as a placeholder, but the new site that Brendan has built is really very user-friendly from the point of view of both us, the contributors, but also the people who are the end users, people who are going to be reading and enjoying and using that information.
Right, and that's also a shout out to anybody who's listening. You know, come join the DInfinity site, come join the Skirmisher site, be a part of the community. We want you guys there with us and designing with us and talking to us. We're always interested in talking to our fans. We still haven't got Brendan back. Once we get him back, we'll come back to him with a few questions, but we'll move on to a question from the audience. We ask you guys every couple of weeks to give us a question from the audience. Tonight we have two. We'll do the other one towards the end of the show. But we have a question from Lucas. He says, "How do you handle different cultures in play, or does it always default to the European fantasy mentality?" So that's a really good question, and appreciate Lucas asking. If you'd like to ask us a question, please do so at DInfinity.live on Twitter, DInfinitylive@gmail.com for email, or you can catch us on Facebook too. So I'm gonna kick it over to Richard. I have an answer too, but I really am interested in hearing what Richard has to say about this topic.
Well, for one, I like to do the old anachronistic approach. Meaning that I don't really care what the time period is for the campaign, as long as the world itself makes sense. I don't necessarily go for a purely Western style fantasy background. Most of the elements I use are Western themed, mostly because that's what most people are familiar with. So as a grounding for the setting, I'll usually start with that, but then I try to deviate from that as much as possible. And if I can, I'll try to escape feudal settings as much as I can, in as much as this culture might be feudal over here, but this one over here may have a Renaissance feel. And I try to make sure that my cultures are as different as possible, but don't seem so incongruous that they couldn't actually exist for that particular world. So that's what I try to do. I mean, I try to include elements from Eastern cultures as much as I can, but sometimes that can be difficult because then you have to explain why people who look so different are so close together. You know, why is it that these two group of people look so radically different? Like, why do you have people who look European next to people who look Asian, and why don't they have more similarities between them?
Is this coming from someone who went to school in L.A.? I mean, really?
Yeah, well, it's not so much just that. I went to college in LA, but I mean, I grew up in the Bay Area. But even, I mean, yeah, there's kind of a mix of variety in that regards. But like, if you think about it from a genetic standpoint, that doesn't make sense why you would have such stark contrast between two groups of people if they were that close to each other.
Well, and I suppose the same could be said for things like, orcs and elves, things of that nature in a fantasy campaign.
Well, no, because they're more of a separate species. But when you have like certain types of differences, like with elves, you might say, okay, well, you got like the high elves, and then you have the forest elves, or you have drow and stuff like that. If they live close enough together that they can intermix, then thinking in a scientific manner, they should have some kind of blending going on, especially along the borders between the two. I mean, even if they're stark contrast in them and they're like enemies, they're still going to have some mixing, especially if you take into consideration the type of warfare that you're talking about for a medieval setting. There's probably going to be, lots of, capture, of women, which of course means that they're, basically the old line of rape and pillage that's going to be going on in terms of like the, the barbaric hordes invading.
Which is a really valid point. There's going to be lots of things of that nature, but even periods of peace would have an intermixing where the half drow or the half orc and half elf would come from.
So what was the original question again?
The original question was, how do you handle different cultures in play, or does it always default to a European mentality? So for me, it usually defaults to European. That's what I've studied the most through my life. I've loved the Renaissance period since I was a young teenager. I went to my first Renaissance festival, which my wife and I just went to last week for like the 13th year in a row together. So, it always seems to default to that. But I have used Asian cultures in the past. I've used things from movies and stuff like that. And I've also used things that weren't anachronistic necessarily. I would use magic trains or firearms or things like that. What about you, Will? Do you always default to a European thing, or do you spread out?
It's kind of tricky. What I do whenever I want to indicate that it's a different culture or a different ethnic group, my default is to have the NPCs from that group speak with a specific accent. And I listen to a lot of BBC Radio 4 online, which is a lot of like BBC comedy and drama. So that's kind of my kind of go-to thing. Okay, they've just encountered this new group. What's an accent that I've heard on the BBC that I think I can reproduce? And because I'm a ham, it works out great. I recently did, it was last year, I did this big space opera campaign, and I just kind of made notes on like what accent people from all the different planets had. And so there was one planet where people kind of had this like sort of where everybody kind of talked like socialites in movies from the 1950s. Oh, hello, how are you doing? I'm doing smashing. Then I had another planet where these like reptile people lived on, where I decided that the reptile language was hard to translate, so they spoke in this like Middle European broken English, welcoming for you to touching down on the world. And then I had another planet where there was a war between these two population groups, where the original settlers, some of them had mutated and some of them had stayed purely human. And so the more or less human part of the planet's population had these just kind of generic British accents, and then the mutants all had Welsh accents. And so the players in this campaign could immediately tell if they hear a Welsh accent, okay, well then they know that this guy's a mutant from this particular planet. So that's kind of my thing. The first thing I go to before I describe what their architecture looks like or what their clothing looks like or their skin or facial features, I go straight to an accent, because there's like in the moment they can then differentiate that from anything else that they might be hearing in the game.
Yeah, and that's a great way to do it. I've done it with hats. I wear a different hat for a different race, and that's worked well for me. Mike, the Swords of Coast system, which you play in almost exclusively when you play Dungeons and Dragons type games, is Greek. It's primarily Greek. How do you put in other cultures from other sides in Coast?
That's a good question, and let me start by saying that's something that has been in the forefront of my mind as a game developer for many, many years. Back in the late 90s, I co-authored the Writer's Complete Fantasy Reference with Terry Brooks. And one of the chapters that is in this book is about how to incorporate other cultures into your D&D games or your stories, which is what we were talking about there. But I think the question maybe is operating under a faulty premise, inadvertently so. The question is about, do you include other cultures, or does it default to a European basis? I don't think most games default to a European basis. I think the European basis that we're saying they're defaulting to is not that. I think they're derivative of Tolkien. That's what we're looking at. They're not defaulting to a European cultural basis. They're ripping off Lord of the Rings. So it's even less imaginative and less redeeming than the question would suggest. So yeah, I'm sensitive to that in the Swords of Coast fantasy campaign setting. We've got a big source book coming out, and I'll be damned if all we're going to do is trot out another book that has towns full of Tudor-style architecture. I mean, you know, it's so tired and so old. We've got elves, we've got dwarves, we've got orcs, we've got hobgoblins, because these are all standard D&D elements, and we wanted to make sure that a standard D&D game could fit into our setting. But as you note, we're set on a Greek island. That is the core of the campaign setting, and then it expands out from there. And if you go from the Greek island of Kos 3 miles east, you are on mainland Asia. You are in Anatolia, Turkey. So basically, how do we incorporate many different cultures? We picked an island that was on the cusp of Europe and Asia, and we put a cosmopolitan trade city on it. And we know very well, based on the way things work in the real world, that people from all over the world are going to come through a cosmopolitan mercantile city. So hobgoblins from the mainland are coming into Coast City to trade. Greeks from throughout the Aegean are coming there. Egyptians from Egypt. We know that in the real world, the Roman Empire had direct trade with India. So in a fantasy world, it's easy to say, we've got Indians, we've got Greeks, we've got Moroccans, we've got Italians, we've got Spaniards, we've got Germans, we've got Britons. So how do I incorporate many cultures into a campaign setting? I look at the way that has happened in the real world. I look at cities like London or Athens or Rome or Istanbul, and I say, oh, wait, every one of those cities historically, at least at its peak, has had a multicultural, international, cosmopolitan makeup to it. Just like LA when I was sort of ribbing Richard, just like any modern cosmopolitan city today. So I incorporate those elements very, very, very naturally because I think it would be natural that when you have sailors and merchants and adventurers from even just 1,000 miles in each direction, that you're going to get that composite multicultural feel. Just as a final word, I don't incorporate Far East Asian stuff into the Swords of Coast setting because it's been done. It's been done. So when you go to Coast, you know, assassins are just fine. We don't need ninjas. Paladins are just great. I don't need to throw in a samurai. It's been done. It's not particularly imaginative or interesting, and I really don't include a lot of that in the setting.
Right.
That said, I also don't include a lot of Tudor architecture. No Tudor architecture, no ninjas, but just about everything in between.
So I want to mention the point that you made during your comment there and open it up to Richard and Will. Is European, the idea of a European RPG, is that Tolkien? Is that just a ripoff like Mike says? What about you, Richard?
Well, Tolkien himself even said, you know, in interviews that a lot of the stuff that he did was based off of Middle English or even Old English. I mean, he wrote a paper that kind of upset a few people in the academic world when he said Beowulf was just a story that people told just to entertain themselves, rather than being some kind of allegory, because at the end of it there's this element of Christianity in it. So people were trying to say that it was originally used to convert people to Christianity, but he said no, this is just a story people told to entertain themselves. Right. And then he even said the language of the elves was based off of Finnish. And so there's a lot of stuff that he did where he just took wholesale cultures, Viking era cultures, and imported them into his setting. So, other than a few changes here and there that he did, linguistically speaking, most of what he wrote and described was from the world that he knew as an academic, as a historian. So There are some things in it that are very Western in how they're designed, but I think that's mostly rooted in the storytelling itself than it is more of the cultures that he created. Because there's nothing that says a culture has to be X, Y, or Z, just because the author is from a specific region or time.
Right.
And I think it gets problematic in a D&D environment when you're drawing too much off of a medieval Judeo-Christian background, because it creates all sorts of conflicts. Basically, everybody thinks their paladin is supposed to somehow be modeled on a 13th century Templar. And that becomes problematic as in most D&D settings, it isn't really a Judeo-Christian culture at all. It's a pagan culture. So you're saying, well, they would have done this and they would have done that, whereas what they would have done in 13th century France is not necessarily what somebody with a pagan background, which is what you're getting in a D&D game, would have necessarily done. So that's another reason we set our campaign setting, the Swords of Coast setting, in a clearly Dark Ages Greece pagan setting, because nobody can say what they would have done. No, it's a fantasy environment, and then we threw in an apocalypse, so that our setting is a century after an apocalypse. So we've got the terrain of ancient Greece, we've got the myths of ancient Greece, but nobody can say, well, this is what they would have done, because our background is different than anything that ever really happened. And I think it's important for a game designer to break out of that mold of, well, what they would have done or what they would have had to do. No, they, in our setting, had a completely shattered culture, and they have had to reinvent it. So whatever we've done works.
Right, and oh, go ahead, Richard.
I was going to say, I think what really stands out here, and something that is kind of the driving force behind most campaign settings in terms of how they work, is something that Mike has done with Swords of Coast, and that's based on economics. I mean, whatever happens, I mean, as a species, we're very economically driven. We try to, it's like if you want to go back to what's his name, Freud's pleasure principle thing. We want to do things that give us pleasure while avoiding pain. Well, not eating is something that we try to avoid, not going hungry. So if you have any kind of setting, you have to look at the resources available. What kind of culture is going to grow out of that?
Right.
And so for that purpose, I think what really works and comes across as maybe being a Western element is that a lot of cultures are wheat-based in terms of their agriculture. And that's what really gives it a Western feel, because wheat is not as labor-intensive as rice. And so the communal feel that you have from one culture to another changes based off of its staple grain crop.
Right.
And Will, I wanted to give you a moment to talk about this subject. And we were talking about Tolkien. I'm not a huge fan of Tolkien myself. I thought he was very long-winded. I kind of feel the same way about Anne Rice, for that matter. But I do see what Mike was talking about, how when we think about Western cultures, we're thinking about Tolkien rather than what they actually had in Germania or early France. And do you feel the same, or?
Well, I guess the one thing to keep in mind, I guess, is as a GM, so much of what might be brought up that some people might say is culture, I bring up as window dressing. If I'm running two different fantasy, no, actually, I'll even take that back. If I'm running a science fiction campaign that takes place on like a cult, like space that's being colonized somewhere out there, but then I'm also running a fantasy campaign that's set in a version of feudal Japan where they have magic. If once my adventurers enter the town in magical feudal Japan versus the small mining outpost on a barely terraformed moon, when it comes down to it, those are the same. Those are going to be the same thing. They're a small community. The only thing that's going to be different is the forms of address that people use are going to be a bit different. The styles of clothing people are going to be different. I might, when they go into the magical town in Asia, I might describe the scent of tea coming out of a tea house and the way the light shines off of rice paper being used in the walls. Whereas with the colony, I might describe the way the light shines off the prefabricated aluminum and how you can smell ozone coming out of the moisture evaporators.
Right.
But when it comes down to it, they're still the same thing. They're a tiny community where people live and work and play. And there are certain things that are so universal to the human experience, like that town, that the culture, for lack of a better term, is just window dressing. Like, it's the truly different culture is only going to really be, in one of my campaigns, from my experience, it's only going to really become a big difference if like a big matter of custom comes up. Like for instance in the game with like Supernatural Japan, if like an NPC samurai is coming through this environment and one of the players insults him, there's very likely they're going to have a duel on their hands, if not like a duel of honor, if not an outright execution. Whereas if they're on this this colony, and the guy, the administrator for the colony, walks by and they insult him, he'll just load their name into a database and blacklist them, and it's just going to be sort of different consequences. That's where it really matters to me is, are there any taboos or mores or societal structures that are going to cause interesting consequences? That's where the big differences are going to come out in play.
Good point.
Yeah, and conflict does breed fun and creativity. So having that conflict is very important for a GM. So we've been talking to Brendan on back channels here for the last few minutes. He's not going to be able to get back in. The way the technology works is we can't just bring him back in. If there's a problem, we would have to stop the show and bring it back. He's watching. We just want to thank him for joining us. We'll try to do something afterwards to add a second video for tonight where we're going to talk to Brendan. So we'll try to get that done this evening as well for everyone. So remember, if you want to contact us, you can contact us during the show over Twitter at DInfinityLive. So make sure and hit us up. But let's move on. We're going to talk about what we're reading this week. I'm going to go ahead and start since I have mine handy. I've been reading the first edition reprints.
Oh.
Yeah, there we go. Got some applause action going. I'm actually planning on doing a first edition game that we're going to do live on YouTube every couple of weeks. Probably is going to start after the first of the year, so keep a lookout for that. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. I think probably the most interesting thing about the reprints, I don't know, have you guys seen the reprints at all?
I haven't seen them, no.
No, that's awesome. I'm the first with them. But they're slavishly recreated. I mean, it looks just like the old school thing. The cover's different, obviously. The pages have kind of a gold foil on the edge to make it kind of neat, but all the art is there. The mistakes are all there. Everything you know and love about the game is there, and I think that's probably one of the most interesting thing about it. And I've seen the 3.5 reprints. I'm considering buying those because that actually has the errata built in, all the errata that they put out. So it's more. The reprint is actually more than what you would normally get. But what about you, Mike? What are you reading this week?
Well, I'm reading a wonderful book called Swords Post Necropolis. And someone might ask with good reason, Mike, you ninny, why are you reading a book that you wrote and for National Novel Writing Month a year ago and which was published in May? And are you really telling the truth? Are you really reading this book that you wrote, you goofball? And the answer is yeah, I am. Because I'm participating in National Novel Writing Month again, and every day has been a struggle to write my 1,667 words in the sequel to Necropolis. So I'm working on the sequel to this book right now. The sequel will not be called Necropolis 2, I hope. I need to come up with a better name.
The Reckoning.
The Reckoning. But it'll be Swords of Coast something. And it will be a self-standing book. So if somebody were to buy just the sequel, they're not going to get a book and say, oh, crap, I got the sequel. I'm not going to be able to know what's going on. It's really a follow-on book more than a sequel. But for people who enjoyed the first book, they're going to enjoy the second one because it does follow the same adventures and through some of the same places. But I've got to be reading the old book because I have to get my details straight. So the characters will go back through an area, and I've got to go, and then I've got to read back through the chapter with the area that they went into to make sure that I get all the details right in the follow-on book so that there are no discrepancies or whatnot. But between writing that, the sequel to Necropolis as part of National Novel Writing Month, I take the comics to the bathroom, and that is it. I have not had the time or the energy to be reading anything else, so I'll have a better answer to that question in the December show that we do next. But yeah, I'm actually sadly reading my own stuff so that I can draw upon it for writing my new stuff.
Yeah, well, we're all I'm working on my book that's followed up to the Swords of Coast setting, Eugenos. So I've read your book for stuff too, so I know exactly what that's like. How about you, Will? What are you reading currently?
I am reading the centenary edition of the Complete Chronicles of Conan.
Ooh, wow!
This is every piece of Conan the Barbarian short fiction that Robert E. Howard wrote.
Awesome.
It's corrected text. It's been a very nice book, a very wonderful read. As you can see, I'm about halfway through on Beyond the Story Beyond the Black River, using a Looney Labs Spectral Dragon card as a bookmark. And it's just been a real wonderful read.
So I've only recently been turned on to Robert E. Howard, surprisingly enough. Most of what I read early on in my life was science fiction, so I didn't read a lot of fantasy stuff. But how does it hold up, Will? Does it still hold up well?
It holds up really well. It's the pacing and everything just moves along so well. There's a lot of the flavor. Like the language has a lot of flavor without actually getting florid, which really wouldn't be appropriate for stories centered around a barbarian. You get a sense for why why so many great comic books and at least one great movie is based on this character and his stories.
Which was the great movie?
I'm gonna go with the first one.
The Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Yeah,
Schwarzenegger. Yeah, right on.
Conan the Destroyer is pretty good, but it falls apart in the third act.
It does, absolutely. What about you, Richard? What have you been reading?
More like, what have I not been reading? Let me grab my stack here. Yeah. In terms of work that I've been doing, I have read this, but I'm rereading again, Savage Worlds Deluxe. And also for work-related stuff, Pathfinder Core Rules. And when I do exercise, meaning walking, I've been reading Time of the Twins. So that gives me something to do. For research, mostly for story development and stuff, Joseph Campbell's The Masks of God, Volume 4, which is creative mythology. And if you want to know stuff about storytelling, this book pretty much covers it, because that's essentially what a story is. It's a form of mythology.
Yep.
Further research on something that I'm doing for hopefully going back to grad school. I'm reading the third installment of Peter F. Hamilton's The Night's Dawn trilogy, called The Naked God, and you can see how thick that one is. That's one book. And at the behest of one of our viewers, Eric Smith, I am reading Amber.
Amber is my wife's favorite series. She reads that entire series about every 18 months from start to finish. She has them all in paperback from their original paperback runs. She's a mad woman about it. But Richard, I want to talk just a minute about Savage World. I just picked up the PDF for myself off of DriveThruRPG and have really been enjoying it. I think it's a neat system. But what's your thoughts on it, on Savage World?
Oh, I like it as a game system. It's really interesting. When I first read the rules, I was like, this is way too simple. But the more you actually look into the mechanics, it's really robust, and it's got a few things that at first glance you might overlook. and that the way the dice scale, and like the way the system works is you have to hit a target number or higher, and basically it's 4 or higher. But the way the dice work in it, you might not actually hit that target number depending on what size die you get to use. However, to make up for that, it has an exploding mechanic. So if you hit the terminal number on that die, you get to re-roll. But the higher the die size you have, the less likely that's going to happen.
Right.
So, I mean, it's really interesting on how it keeps things from getting too far out of control, because the math just works in such a way that the probability isn't going to happen. You're going to succeed, but you're not going to get radically high success. So...
Yeah, it is kind of an interesting way they've worked the math out. I'm really looking forward to trying it out, maybe at a convention sometime soon. So let's move into our next topic. We're going to talk just real quickly about AetherCon. If you go to skirmisher.com, look for Yellow Dragon's Lair, you'll find a blog post called AetherCon, which lays out a whole litany of problems that Skirmisher Publishing and D-Infinity had at AetherCon this weekend. Of course, I keep saying at AetherCon because I'm dumb, but this weekend at AetherCon. So, Mike, let's talk for just a minute about some of the things that we had an issue with. Again, we're not trying to be haters. We just had problems there, and we just kind of want to make it out in the open and talk about it. So, Mike, give us just kind of a quick rundown on what happened this weekend.
Well, I'll speak from the point of view of the publisher of Skirmisher and the editor-in-chief of D-Infinity, and say we got on board with AetherCon because it sounded like a great concept. And for 6 months, we interacted with the organizer of AetherCon and gave a lot of guidance and advice and support. We wanted to be part of it. We wanted it to work. We put our money where our mouth was, and we promised $500 or thereabouts. Maybe it was $480, something substantial in prize support, which we still haven't provided yet because we haven't been given any guidance on what prizes and what to send to whom. We've been given one name, and we contacted that person and asked them what they wanted for a prize, and we haven't heard back from them. So we really got behind this thing. We wanted to see it work. We didn't want to be haters, but it just broke down on every level. They didn't fulfill our promises to us. We provided full prize support for Skirmisher and for D-Infinity, two completely separate entities, and yet I discovered that they were not running the logo for D-Infinity on their website.
Right.
For whatever reasons. I negotiated with them, and they said, well, is D-Infinity separate? I said, if you want D-Infinity to provide full separate prize support, it's separate. They agreed to that, but then they never ran our logo on their site. They always ran the Skirmisher logo on the bottom of their site, so the top half of our logo showed, our skulls, but the name of our company never showed, and it wasn't hot linked, so nobody knew that it was us. They had something called the Bell and Scroll for companies that were supporting and writing about EtherCon. We're writing about it. We're supporting it. You go to our website,
Right.
search for EtherCon. You can see all that we said about it. Turns out they never bothered to list Skirmisher on the Bell and Scroll. And these are all things that they told me. We've done this. We've done this. We've done this. I didn't check on them. I'm busy. I take people at their word. So I think that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, and let me interject just a second. From one of the things that we have as vendors, retail vendors, when we go to conventions, is we have we set up a booth, we set up a table, we make it look nice. Will was with us at Comic Palooza this year. We had just a good looking booth. We had lots of customers come by and just stop and look. Right, exactly, and we didn't have that. I spent 5 times as long to create our booth for EtherCon, and had a half a dozen people.
Booth. Right.
and it was just a big waste of time. So the EtherCon 2013 has been announced. I don't think I'm going to take part.
Well, I can speak for our ventures and say certainly if any of the people here or any of the stakeholders in the venture come to me and make a case, we can certainly reconsider this. I'm not a dictator, but I don't see how or why we would be part of EtherCon in 2013 as much as anything, because I know the people who organized it or a particular person is not true to their word, and I can't work with people who don't do what they say they're going to do. So right there, that's the ultimate red flag. I mean, what could they say to me? We lied to you last year, but we're telling the truth now.
Right.
I can't work with people who I've given everything to, who it turns out behind my back were not doing the things they promised they were going to do. So I don't see, even if it were a successful con, I don't see why we would want to be part of it, simply because I don't feel that I have that kind of rapport and trust with them that I need to have to work with someone.
And Richard, I know you have some comments on this. We'll give you the last word. We'll move on. But what was your experiences there, and is there anything they could do to get you back?
Well, it was severely frustrating, and the main reason for why I feel it was frustrating is because people put in a lot of effort, myself included, for so very little in return. And maybe they were trying to show some form of largesse by keeping it free, but that kind of backfires in that nobody's committed to anything because they're not invested in anything. They don't have a reason to be, because you give somebody something for free, they don't have to actually do anything. Right? There's no reason for them to actually get involved. But if you have them have a vested interest in it, then people would actually show up. Like they're volunteers who they apparently had that didn't show up to do things, probably because it was for free. Nobody wants to work for free. I mean, I'm still a little upset over the fact that I put a venture together for Swords of Coast that I was going to use exclusively at EtherCon as a way to promote not just my short story but the campaign setting. That was nearly 100 hours of work over the course of 2 weeks that I put into it, only to have one person show up to at the
That was me.
That's it. That's all I had. So for all the work that we put into it and going into the chat rooms and trying to find people to play and talking to other vendors and artists and writers, no one showed up.
What about you? Oh, sorry, Richard. What about you, Will? What comments do you have on this?
Well, I was going to be doing one of the tournament scenarios as well, and just right off the bat, the tournament structure I think was too arcane and too ambitious, especially for a first-time convention. It kind of assumed I will say unreasonably high turnout, and so as a result, there's a lot of pressure to get a massive tournament scenario cranked out, and that's the thing. We are all more or less professional creatives, and if I'm trying to write a scenario that's up to my standards, takes a lot of time and effort, and it's for which I'm not getting paid, and I'm not. And we've all talked about how we felt like we were putting a lot of time and energy into it, and nothing was coming back to us. Yeah. There's something you should never, ever, ever tell to a creative person who you want to do something for you, whether it's paid or for free. And this was, I'm not going to say who, but this was part of an exchange. I got there's some emails back and forth, and I got an email about 2 weeks before the convention, which the first line was, "I know this isn't a high priority for you," and the problem is once you've told someone, you've told like someone who's trying to create something for you, that you have all but ordered them to just screw off.
Right.
yes, there are things that I have deadlines for that are going to take a bit more priority. But I don't want to underplay my involvement with this. Do not assume that I don't care because I've got to pay bills first.
Right.
It rubs me the wrong way, and that's and things growing out of that was the reason why in the end my tournament scenario got knocked off the schedule.
Right, and Skirmisher and D-Infinity will have big presences during physical conventions, but I hope we'll have presences at online conventions. This is not us saying we hate all online conventions now. No, that's not what it is at all. We'll be more than happy to. If there's any organizers out there who have online conventions, please come talk to us. We'll be glad to listen. So let's move on. We're going to move on to our last segment. We have our second question from the audience. It's kind of a long question, so I hope you guys will bear with me. And the question from Eric Smith says, what are the pros and cons of games with too little rules or games with too many rules? He says, too little rules, and players cannot help but be led around by the moderator, and there is little consistency. Why are those that espouse this idea of why do those who espouse this side of the coin considered old school? The writings of first edition AD&D generally are considered an old school game and do not seem to condone the rule-light gaming environment. With too many rules, none of us know what's going on. So there's the question. So is there pros and cons to both? And we'll start with Richard.
Well, this is a really complicated question. I mean, because you're really looking at two separate ideas here. And a rules-light environment encourages imagination, but it also requires and encourages a lot of trust. And basically, you're trusting that everybody else who's playing the game is going to play by the same rules. But there aren't that many rules, so how do you play by the same rules? And each person can interpret those rules however they wish. That becomes an issue, and things can break down. I mean, there are several games, including Savage Worlds, which are rules light in the way that they're presented, but they're not rules light. They look like they're rules light because they don't have a lot of overly complex rules for special situations, which is what I think first edition AD&D has. It's not that it's rules heavy. It's that there's so many different situations in it that Gary tried to cover, like weapon speed and what do you do during an encounter? Because there's so many different ways to do initiative in terms of the order of combat, and one of them is based purely on the dramatic tension of the setting. I mean, it just depends on what you're trying to do. So, there's different ways to address things. So that's what he tried to incorporate with those. So a lot of the rules light games that you see today, they just stripped out all of those situational rules. So that's why they look like they're rules light. And basically what you have is a series of games that are inherently effects based, meaning that whatever the game does, it only describes what the effect is, what the outcome's going to be mathematically, and you get to describe what it's going to be. I mean, then you have other games. I mean, if you want to get really, really in depth with rules, you might as well go play Advanced Squad Leader. That thing is unbelievably massive. I mean, I know it's a war game, but wow, is that thing huge. I bought the second edition rules, and I put them in document protectors. It required a 5-inch ring binder to hold everything. That's how big the game is. And literally all I have are the core rules and some of the scenario rules for Red Barricades in there. That's it. There's nothing else in that book. I mean, I actually had to buy a separate binder to put the scenario cards in because it couldn't fit. And so, but mostly of what it covers is situational rules where things start to conflict if you look at just the bare bones rules. Because you have terrain features in that game where it's okay, well, are you in the terrain feature or are you on the terrain feature? Which might seem like just a pain in the ass because you're sitting there looking at it and going, okay, well, what does that mean? But if you were actually on the ground in that location, it would make a lot of sense as to whether or not your units are actually on the edge of a ravine or if they're actually in the ravine, because
Or it's a wood line, or
right.
Right.
And so it's like, how much cover do you get? Well, in D&D, and even a game like Savage Worlds, it pretty much tells you get X percentage of coverage for whatever certain situation, and it's basically limited to, okay, how much obscurity do you have? That's all it's concerned with. It doesn't matter if it's light. It doesn't matter if it's terrain, weather, whatever. That's all you need to look at, is the amount of obscurity, and that's how the rules are designed. So I think it's really a fallacy to look at most games, like role-playing games especially, and say, well, this is rules light and this is rules heavy. No, it's more, this is a bare-bones system that says you get to figure out how the situations play out when they arise, and the other says, this is what you do for these situations. So you basically have descriptive versus prescriptive. It's kind of like looking at like the rules of grammar, like how languages actually work, and telling somebody how to speak. That's the difference.
Right. Well, we only have a couple of minutes before we get to the last word. Will, what do you prefer between the two? Do you prefer a rules light touch or a heavy?
I guess between like rules heavy and rules light, what I'm actually looking for, regardless of whether it's heavy or light, is whether it's a system that's easy to bullshit. And what I mean by that is, if a situation comes up where there really is no rule for it, can I real quickly go, this'll work? Or if a situation comes up where there is a rule for it, but I don't want to waste time looking it up, I can just go, oh, well, this will work, and we'll just keep it consistent like this. That's what I look for. I'm more looking for rule systems that are flexible enough that I can just in the moment churn out a way to bend that system just enough to do whatever I need it to do on the table. Back in the 90s, the original World of Darkness rule set, as much of a beast as that got towards the end, was a really easy rule system to bullshit. If you came across a situation that the rules couldn't handle, just come up with a dice pool, and then there you go. Likewise, I find Savage Worlds to be pretty flexible like that. If you're ever in one of those few situations where there isn't a basic rule for it, just come up with a die code and a target number that makes a kind of sense, and then there you go. But I will say that in more complex systems that can be, well, I guess I'm more likely to do that in more complex systems only because I don't want to spend time looking something up in the rule book. And one very, very bad habit I've noticed once systems reach a certain level of complexity, and I've seen this in D20, I've seen this, regrettably, I've seen this start to crop up in Pathfinder, I've seen this show up in Fantasy Flight games, Warhammer 40K role-playing games, is once they reach a certain level of complexity, a rule for this situation and a rule for this situation, regardless of how similar or different they may be, bear absolutely no resemblance to each other. And if you looked at those rules in isolation, you'd think they were from completely different systems. And I think really just my game design philosophy, come up with as basic of a core mechanic as you can and try to grow everything off of that. So that you don't, so that it's flexible, it's easy to bullshit in for new situations when you go outside of the box, and also so that you never come into, okay, this game uses 6-sided dice, except when you're driving a vehicle, in which case we use a standard deck of poker cards.
Right.
Which I've seen stuff like that. Right. It boggles my mind.
Right, there's overlapping of too many different kinds of systems can break down. So we're running out of time tonight, so we're going to end that conversation there. I'd like to take just a moment. I'm going to put a link in the underbar below, so make sure to check after the show. But a friend of the show, John Kadoff, has a Kickstarter out for a new role-playing game adventure for the Pathfinder game called The Ruins of the Nagafa. So please check that out. We're going to put that in the underbar. Thank you, John. I was the first backer, so I'm glad to be the first person to jump in and help out.
I was the third.
There you go.
Nice.
So we're all fans of John's work, and we really hope that he has the best luck with his Kickstarter. So that's going to lead us to the last word. We're going to start with Richard. Richard, what's your last word for this evening?
Well, I would just say try to stay tuned to the D Infinity blog. I'm going to be posting a few things as to more rules-based work on, for the stuff that I've been doing with Anatomy of Game Design, and something I think will help with EtherCon of actually describing what went wrong and why.
Well, we'll look forward to that. My last word is just make sure to keep an eye on D Infinity. We're going to be on the website. We'll have the links in the underbar, so you'll make sure to get that. We're going to have all kinds of great content over there, news, reviews. If you'd like your product review, please just contact us. We'd love to take a look at your thing and give our reviews of it. Mike, what is your last word, sir?
My last word is, man, I'm just kind of shell-shocked. I haven't hit my word count for today for National Novel Writing Month. So when we're done, I'm going to go try to knock out another 1,100 words today, and then somehow in between Thanksgiving dinner, get 1,667 written for tomorrow. But that is all for a great story for Skirmisher and Swords of Coast readers. So I'm going to be working away on that, and want to wish everyone a happy Thanksgiving, and hope their holiday season kicks off well between now and the next time we see them.
That's true. All right, Will, you get the last word. What is your last word, sir?
All right. I just want to remind everybody that regardless of where you are on this holiday, for Thanksgiving, if you're celebrating and who you're with, that is no reason to not be gaming. After Thanksgiving dinner, my family's going to do what it always does: drink wine and play apples to apples. It's fantastic.
Brilliant.
Well, that's great. We thank everybody for tuning in to a new episode of D Infinity. We'll be back on December 6th at our regular time on Thursday at 8 p.m. Central Time. You'll be able to see us. We'll be talking about the news of the day, some interesting projects we're working on, and have a special guest. So if you have any questions, make sure to tweet us at DInfinityLive. Make sure to subscribe to the channel to get all the latest news and information. And please help us out. Like this video. That helps us get further out on YouTube so more people can see us. We thank you, and on behalf of William Thrasher, on behalf of Richard Bosley, on behalf of Michael Varhola, my name is Robert Groover. I thank you, and good night.